So like at the end of this, I just thought because there's remaining audience members who are not like us who are staying with us in the afternoon, like I just thought maybe it'd be nice to like, if anybody had remaining questions that weren't asked, for example, that are like for which time ran out, stuff like that. We don't have to also, but I mean, we have like 20 minutes.
And Sumi is still here? Or?
She might currently be taking her child to a birthday party. She said, but she'll be back like for the afternoon. But yeah, I mean, I guess there's also a way to structure it by asking, does anybody have this like pressing question they couldn't ask before?
Yeah, can I just get you?
Oh yeah,
I was very curious. By the way, it was wildly interesting. With so many ideas. I was wondering about in this kind of burgeoning relationship between Taoist ideas and German Jews intellectuals in the first half of the 20th century. Was there in this coming together any place for Russia, for instance, for communist Russia in particular? Was there any connection to it? Was there any comparison being made between an alternative to capitalism, a substantive way of thinking, as suggested by certain Taoist ideas, and what was happening in Russia, and their alternative to capitalism?
Yeah, that's a really tough question. It's a tough question. It's also a massive one. So obvious, yes. I haven't. I mean, the obvious link is Benjamin.
That's what I'm asking.
I honestly don't have a great answer to that at the moment. To sort of, I don't have a ready answer to like, does the introduction of Taoist ideas have anything to like relativize or like, angle in a particular way the reception of like, Soviet Russia ideas, and also like the migration coming out from Russia at that point. No, it's a good question. I think, there's no like, overt comparison being made.
Is there any direct?
I don't think so. But I will say like there's one weird moment in Benjamin's Moscow diary. So when he took a trip to Moscow, and he's so one of the famous sort of East Asian images from that is like when he's in his hotel and he's like noticing that there's a bunch of Tibetan monks who don't close their doors or whatever, and that's one thing. But then the second thing is like, and I'm only mentioning this because I haven't actually worked through what the significance is, but he talks about this street in Moscow, and actually when you translate it, it means Chinatown. I don't remember what it, but the street that he's talking about in the section of Moscow Diary actually is about Chinatown. So like I'm just saying like when he goes to Moscow, he's thinking about Chinatown. I think that's kind of intriguing, and I don't know. I just have to do the work of interpretations and things like that. But yeah.
Well, I think at that time, China and Russia were not related. In that particular moment of time and history and place, where Russia experience or the Soviet experience was more like an off-branch of the European modernity, while China and Oriental is something else. I think that was more distant than what we would claim today, when the Soviet Union and China both went through the communist revolutions, but not in the beginning of time.
Yeah, I wasn't thinking about a relation between Russia and China per se, but a relation between the way they were perceived in the West. Those two sources of ideas about sort of different ways of organizing society and the economy. And also, I'm thinking about the way about the fact. I was thinking about the fact that the Russian influence in Europe, the cultural influence of Russian in the 19th century, the whole kind of we have to be less monotheistic, we have to be more spiritual, there's something, like an individual soul that has to come into discussions on politics, etc., or the Soloviev and philosophers of that kind. Were influenced by Orientalist ideas. So that kind of influence was an Eastern type of influence, a philosophical influence, that also expressed itself in political and economic ideas. So from that point of view, there are these different sources of alternatives to Western capitalism, of an Oriental influence. Obviously different ones, but
I think one broader implication of this question is at a certain point it was a debate still at that point whether Russia was Eurasian or European or Asian.
Still a debate at this point.
It's still, clearly it's become an ideological talking point today, but back then that was the question, geographically and also geopolitically speaking, what is Russia? Is it Asia? Is it Eurasia? Is it whatever?
Even Soviet Russia was almost.
And so that's part of the relevance of at least from me personally, relevance to thinking about very, very similar geographical imaginaries today. It's those debates started actually in that exactly 100 years ago.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Anyway, Russia today is a kind of power that still wants to project that.
Well, no, they're overtly calling themselves Eurasian, and that's just. But from what
nothing bad about Russia is seen as being Asiatic, right? So.
Well, that's the. I don't think Russia was considered Asiatic in terms of the mode of production, but then in what sense is it?
The perception. So Putin, when he does what he does, is seen as Asiatic in temperament in terms of his despotic nature. And there's a lot of stuff in the European press which thinks about Russia as not being Europe precisely because of the nature of the power that Putin exercises.
Sure. There's a difference though between that and the political economic basis for the type of relation between state and whatever, state bureaucracy and in each of those. Yeah, so it's a big mess, but then that's one of the areas where the question arises.
This is very different from the kind of argument that Berdyaev makes, right? About the soul. By the Asiatic soul and the tussle for Russia's soul between Asia and Europe. And this is a more empirical, political, but I'm sure there are multiple dimensions of this.
Another question for Dilip and Hourya, just something that I thought about you. In your presentation yesterday, I thought there was this cautious trend of the vitalist happening in relation to them to an extent, and then in relation between animals and humans, and as it's found in texts, say for instance. And I was thinking of forms of capital within your presentation and the idea of the afterlife as appearing, or the way in which you think of time as appearing differently. And is there any connection between the vitalist and the modes of capital that you encounter, the violent hierarchies that you encounter within certain feudal structures or neo-feudal structures of different sorts, right? Does that create some of these imaginaries? So I don't have a fully framed question, but I thought there may be some sort of an association, or is there a different way of thinking of vitalism as well?
I do not think through vitalism in particular, but if you think about Amitav Ghosh and his landscape and timescape, and think about his entire oeuvre, as it were, we have this notion of a very expansive space-time, which is that of the ocean. He was the first to actually connect up, the Africa, Asia, the Middle East in one space, and also that wonderful thing in Shadow Lines, where he thinks about the ways in which nations come to be constructed, and he's sitting in a library, and he has this dividers, and he puts it on a map, and he thinks when there is a riot, a Hindu-Muslim riot that breaks out in Chittagong in eastern India, and this affects Delhi almost immediately, and then he puts the divider, and then he draws another circle. And that includes a whole swathe of Europe, and he says, what is the event in Europe that could have created this kind of flurry? An event in Baku, for example, could trigger off a revolution in France. And then he speculates about the time of imperial warfare. Right? The wars in Europe are over, he said at that time, and that is what led to the stability of nations. In India, the war is ongoing, and it's an internal civil war, like you had the wars of religion in the 17th century. So there are these multiple, eruptions of space-time that happen in his work. And so in Gun Island, it's about the idea of labor by the Bangladeshis who are in Venice. So when he has the uncanny experience of walking down the streets of Venice and hearing Bengali, it's actually about global capital and the displacement of people, but it's also related to the displacement of people through tides. Right? So it's something that is a much longer geological time, and then there is the contingent time of capital. So actually, Amitav Ghosh is amazing to think with in terms of the kinds of, because in Gun Island, of course, there is also the time of the supernatural. So he's in the plane, and then he sees the snakes. He imagines the snakes from the Sundarbans, the mangrove swamps, whizzing past his plane window. And suddenly you have another time emerging. And I think that concatenation of time and space is really possibly one way of thinking about our present, where we think with one time. They're all Hegelian, unreconstructed Hegelian, the time of capital, the time of neoliberalism, but there are these multiple times which are constantly colliding, intersecting, and so on. And I think that's why the idea of childhood becomes very interesting, because these are all, in many senses, times in their infancy as well, right? I mean, to kind of displace the thing from the child onto time. Many times in their infancy, which are all struggling with each other. And that is what we see as the future. And we wait for it to be born, but sometimes they die. Right? I don't know whether that's an answer to your question, but...
In relation to what you were saying, do you think that's at different times, or it's a different time other than this time?
Which time?
The times you are kind of referring to. You are speaking about, we are also discussing the question of the pluricentric.
Yes.
And I think there's also a question to ask in terms of what defines that kind of time.
Right. Just to suggest, there's this wonderful novel by this Congolese writer, Tristan Majula, called Tram 83. And it's set in the capital city of Congo. And it's all about that febrile post-colonial atmosphere. People are hanging about, they're in bars, there are sex workers, there are workers. But one sentence that keeps recurring through 75 times, I have to speak about this book, so that's how I know it's got so. So the 75 times this phrase comes up, what time is it? Right? Some character or the other is asking that, and each time that question is asked, it's referring to a different kind of time. The time of labor, the time of leisure, the time of human, the time of pleasure, and so on and so forth. So I think when we think about time, you have to think about time in its plurality, and that's what Amitav Ghosh manages to do. But somehow, in the way in which we theorize and when we do our social theory, we think with one time.
I think I also it's not like I know a lot about this, but
nor do I.
Yes, but like that question, what time is it? Of course, it's a metric question. It's also a semiotic.
Right.
It's also and that's the response to that can exist within the capitalist system, but also outside of it.
Right.
So I think that's what I was trying to understand, to what's the quality of the nature of that time other, which isn't that's this kind of time. That's we seem to be talking about in terms of questions of oppression and. I don't know. So when you were referring to this, the question of the child, or that we see emerging these times, what time is that? How, what kind of question? I'm just asking questions.
Yes. No, of course.
I don't have an
I would like to ask you some questions back as well. Because I think when you ask what time is that, I think that depends on the elaboration which we wish to make. But I think we think with singularities rather than with multiplicities. And that's, again, as a historian, I think this is the fundamental failing of history. Right? I mean, Althusser had a nice jibe about that as well, that historians don't have a theory of time, they just have a chronology. Right? So I think the theory of time would mean handling time in its multiplicity. And it goes back to some of the things that you were saying. Right? You can talk about multiple temporalities, polytemporalities, and so on, to just borrow some of the ideas that you spoke about. And that is what is really then allows us to engage with what is beyond the human as well. Not that the human lives in one time, and the humans don't, but when one thinks beyond the able-bodied adult male, who is usually the subject of theorizing, and who is the inhabitant and the producer of theory, then what happens when you bring in these other times which are related to much longer swathes? Right? And this is what Dipesh Chakravarti writes about in his new book, about the question of, when we say the world will heal itself. Right? So despite all our actions, the world will heal. It's true, but it will heal itself in its own time, when we don't exist anymore. Right? It'll take a few million years and it'll heal itself. And then one only has to, and there's something that I mentioned briefly in my presentation, that if we think about places like Chernobyl or the demilitarized zones between North and South Korea, where there are no humans, right? And it's been a very short time where there have been no humans. Chernobyl is 86, the other is the 50s, but those are spaces in which there is a huge efflorescence of nature. Right? And extinct species have come back to life. So in Chernobyl, you have Przewalski's horse, which is now galloping across the plain like it did a few hundred years ago, because there are no humans there. So this kind of, to think with this, it's not just metaphorical, I think. And to think with plants, animals, and life on Earth, a life as such, right, rather than human life, actually allows you a point of entry into questions of time and space which are far more productive, which is why I'm very eclectic in my reading. I don't have a position.
I understand. Isn't that not a relationship to our own humanity? Like, like in a sense, this is also a question in which we are constructed as human beings.
Yes.
We could be doing something else.
Yeah, but then we can only do what we can do, right? I mean, I cannot think like a frog. I mean, that is the fundamental. What is that famous article by Tom Nagel? Yes. Yeah. Who knows what the bat thinks?
Yeah, I think I'm only saying that because that's not like that time. It's kind of outside of us in a sense. We can also engage with it.
Yeah, we can. Yeah, we can engage with it.
Right?
Yeah, and of course, it will be from a standpoint that is ours. I mean, and what it is to truly inhabit the mind of a frog or the mind of a tree. There are certain displacements that happen, right, in the process of that. But that's why, like I said in my talk, I think reading these articles, the scientific articles in Nature and the others which are accessible to me, a lot which is not accessible to me intellectually, there isn't the kind of sentimentality of identification, right, which happens there. Whatever the myth of objectivity may be, there is an attempt to study these phenomena as they happen and to derive something from it. And I find it useful to think with that. So there isn't this question of affinity that is required. There is the separateness at the same time as an attempt to understand. And I think that's probably the best we can hope for. Yeah, unless we have a mystical experience and you become one with the bear, like the shamans, right?
Well, maybe to say that I think the fiction and the invention of the time, it's crucial for the critical theory, because if you lost the idea of past, present, and future, it's quite complicated to put inside an logocentric narrative, something like that. And I think the same, that we are really losing the fiction of the time now. And I think we are losing the fiction of the time because we are in a kind of mega commodity life. So the commodity is already present in the simultaneous times. So I can be here, but I can be with this device, my telephone, in another place, in the same moment, in the same spatial. So when I put together 3, 4, 5 space, I collapse the idea of time. I collapse the idea of time. And it's the same with the book, but with the book I just can be in a 2 different space with a long process, interaction with the book and interaction with the material reality. But when we are with this device, this commodity device, we really collapse the time and we can think of the future. No? And it's clever, the example of I'm going to kill the children because they are here like future like the future. They are here like killers. No? So I go ahead, no? And I put a bomb in this territory because they are already like killers in the commodity form. So it's amazing what is happening. It's amazing. It's amazing. It's not a mythic thing. It's a real thing, a quotidian thing, and it's destroying the rationality of the modern world.
Another time. Perhaps.
Yeah, it's a mixing of time that is just space now, and it's collapsing the enlightenment forms, the rational forms, the action forms, pragmatic forms.
Good place to cut.
So, on that extremely,
Sobering
very sobering.
Now let's have lunch.
Take time for lunch.
Let's allow the time.
To lunch.
Let's declare it's time for lunch. Thank you all who came for both this. Came on this weekend. It's not raining, so I know you're going to be outside. No, thanks again for being here. Thanks again to all our speakers for coming all the way here and like spending all this time, all this effort, putting your heads together around this topic. I know I'm making you do some more work after lunch, but thank you for a moment, and again, please join me in,
Thank you.
Thank you for bringing all these brilliant minds together.